So essentially, the title of my talk is How to Product Manage a Career in Product. Essentially, what I wanted to do is bring forth product management principles so that you can build a career in product in the way that I accidentally did. So it's kind of a do as I say, not as I do. And my forthcoming title actually happens to be Head of Product at Charged Up. So near the end of the presentation, I'll be talking a little bit about this device here, as well as some of the stickers on my laptop. But the focus of my presentation will strive to be on the boiler room side, because I know that's what's brought some of you people in attendance here today. So again, quick background. I'm Pam, there's my LinkedIn, and something I wanted to get across right away is I'm a non-technical PM. I don't have a technical background, and I'm a non-early adopter. I'm the person that doesn't upgrade their iPhone 6 until it is absolutely necessary, which I think is kind of a cardinal sin, but also means that I'm the type of audience that usually a product needs to win over. I don't just jump at the next technology, and therefore being in product means that I kind of can relate to users that are hesitant versus those that are kind of jumping the gun right away. This is a cheesy cartoon of me. Essentially, the Clubhouse.io team, which is a ticketing system similar to Jira and various other kind of product management software, I think found it interesting that I happened to be head of product last year. So they decided to do an interview about me. It happens to be online if you want to get a Cole's Notes version of the presentation I'm about to give today. It essentially goes over my career journey and how I accidentally ended up leading up a brand that I was really excited about from afar. But first, as with any career, it kind of started as a clean slate. And initially, my first employer has been kind of my most formative in that I spent over 5 years in a telecommunications company. Generationally, I think that's quite rare because usually those companies are seen as regressive or old school. And in actuality, I think my lucky stars that I was able to join a new grad scheme with Telus. Because in Canada, not only are they a well-known brand and have big budgets, it's a large enterprise, but they happened to be very digitally progressive, and they were constantly on the vanguard of cool technology. So it felt as if I was working in the cliche as a bit of like a startup within a large enterprise environment. I'll get into more of that later. But essentially, the foundations of my product career and where I even first heard the term product was at Telus. Then I joined Ticketmaster, kind of transitioning from large enterprise to large enterprise, but this time now getting into live entertainment, everything to do with the music industry, and obviously also sports, theater, etc., being based out of the London office. And that is how I somehow parlayed into Boiler Room, which is a music startup that I'll give more context on later for those unfamiliar with the brand. But essentially, it's similar to the model that Product School is doing right now, where this is being live streamed and it will get uploaded and archived onto on-demand channels. But essentially, the core experience is for those of you in the room. And usually, it's a little bit different because it's more of a DJ rave or a grime concert or just all kinds of live performances in interesting venues trying to raise the profile of underground artists. I really enjoyed my time there. And for anyone that can never attend an event, I would hope to encourage you to do the same. Meanwhile, I wanted to bring to light that somehow this bizarre combination of employers has led me on to my next opportunity, which again, I'll be giving a demo at the end of the presentation. Essentially, it is called Charged Up, and it is a network of phone charging across currently London, very soon the UK, gradually Europe, etc. It's exciting because it's technically just a little power bank that you can rent from point A to point B to constantly ensure that your phone is being charged. There's a lot more I could go into, but let's first dive into the presentation. If nothing else, what I'd love for you guys to take away from today is number one, define your product vision when it comes to your career. So focus on your user experience instead of traditional milestones and being competitive across, when you browse people's LinkedIn profiles and thinking, well, it only took them 2 years to ascend from associate to PM. Come on in. Or, based on what this person's career trajectory looks like, here's what I should be doing as well. Really define it to yourself and what you want to get out of it. A lot of product management is ambiguous by default. You can make your career your own journey and not necessarily have it already pinned down far in advance. Number two, build it to scale. So try as much as possible to have a scalable career as opposed to being too much of a specialist. I'll get into that in a bit. There's some data points to back this up. But essentially, again, really gain transferable skills whenever you can and constantly be challenging yourself, whether hopping across different industries or taking on different facets of a role within a company. And finally, know your own acceptance criteria. What will you define as your kind of definition of done at every given role and what you want to achieve out of it? So try to come up with ways that you can be data informed, whether it's in asking for role enlargement in your existing employer, or as some of you are doing, actually trying to transition into PMing. How can you do that in ways that make value-based decisions as opposed to just pressure or external forces kind of tagging you along? Really try to leverage your strengths as you see fit. So I wanted to kind of zoom out for a second and think back to when we were kids. These are probably the types of professions that we thought about as, when I grow up, I want to be a chef or potentially a project manager even. Those were terms that we were familiar with. And usually those careers have really linear career paths. There's a specific degree you have to do, there's the gradual ascension, there's probably some form of designation or formal body that you have to get letters beside your name, and then you ascend within an organization. Usually you're encouraged to stay within the same employer. Gradually now it's more acceptable to bop around, but essentially there's a very clear line of ascension. This is Office Space, and what I wanted to get across is, first of all, obviously this image usually is kind of used in a sarcastic way, so like the Office Space guy is clearly in a job that's not the most enthusing or giving him the most self-realization. I actually really like Post-its now because in product management, as some of you are already aware, it's how you're able to actually very quickly change an entire roadmap or bring forth cool new ideas or provide feedback in an anonymous way. Whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, it becomes just a part of your voice at the table. So I'm a big advocate of Post-its and in general of the switch from project to product management. Not to be adversarial, there are definitely industries where project management just fits a lot better. Like construction, you wouldn't want to be agile and nimble and add columns and then take them away. Project management has its place, but if you're thinking of going into or already are in product management, realistically, you want to embrace the Post-its. You want to embrace the ability to have collaborative conversations across a variety of groups. So here's a small sampling of job descriptions I was able to pull up. Some are active, some are not, and I'm not advocating any of these as employers for better or worse. I'm just throwing it out there. For example, a job description for a product manager on the search team specific to Slack is going to be quite different from search at list. Meanwhile, other job descriptions for product can really, really vary. So that's digital product manager for Eurosport at Discovery, senior product manager at Amazon, got a bunch at Beamery, including a release manager, which might be coordinating what other PMs are doing. Over at ASOS, they've got someone specific to mobile as opposed to a studio director, etc. And the list goes on at Yelp. They genuinely have incredibly specific work streams that each PM is responsible for. Different organizations have different structures. In essence, what I'm trying to convey is clearly there's no specific job description, and anyone in these roles probably wasn't a child on the playground dreaming of being the role that they are now. These roles didn't exist, and you might not know exactly what career path they took to get there. Not only that, but a lot of the roles that I just described now have some dependency on algorithms. So it's very much kind of the rise of the robots. That's actually a really great thing because getting into product management right now means that we are the group that is learning as these technologies evolve, and they can take all kinds of different permutations that incredibly smart people are putting together. You get to be the group that kind of makes them happen and gets to implement these technologies across any of the apps on our phone. Anyone in the room can give an example of an app that leverages an algorithm in some way, shape, or form? Anything that you regularly use that you know uses an algorithm? For example? Facebook, and how so?
Based on interests that you've either explicitly or implicitly shown and the content that they show you in the newsfeed.
Brilliant. So just to say it out loud for the camera, essentially constantly customizing and personalizing what you are seeing. So more and more catered to you such that you engage longer with that product. Can anyone think of a different example, perhaps inspired by any of the others? Amazon, and how so?
Yeah, but once you buy something, it recommends you, it has a recommendation engine that is based on machine learning, based on your past purchases and everything. I mean, it creates a list of recommended product based on what you're looking for.
Beautiful, and I think you even said that loudly enough. I'll just repeat it very briefly. Essentially, Amazon and the constant recommendations of purchases based on machine learning to constantly keep you hopefully buying more stuff. Excellent answers, and obviously, as you can imagine, a lot of work happens behind the scenes to implement them in a way that feels organic, that you as a user actually want those types of experiences. There's ethical arguments either way. I won't get into that in this presentation. What I wanted to bring up is these are the types of things that AI can't do and won't be able to do for a while, if ever. So of the 5 things that were brought forth by Kai-Fu Lee's book, AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order, if you'd like to take a look at that later. Of those 5, I kind of narrowed out dexterity because essentially I'm not sure what parallels I could draw, but I can certainly see the connection between creativity, complexity or strategy, learning new, unknown, and unstructured environments, as well as compassion. I'll get into these in a moment, but I'm sure you can start to fathom how some algorithms can't quite be as compassionate as an actual human being. So again, getting into product can feel like you have to pick a specific trajectory, but really it's more like this. Any friend I've ever made through product meetups and different jobs has had a vastly different trajectory, including their educational background, their career aspirations, general skill set. It really is a practice that's kind of for everyone, by everyone, if you're choosing which type of role suits you best, as well as how you gradually develop your skills. Some of the slides that look beautiful and have this color scheme were not made by me, so shout out to Product Craft by Pendo. I basically ripped a bunch of data that is available online. You guys can hop onto this resource online at any time and view a lot more reports that have been done on product management as a whole. I carved out a few. As I asked at the beginning of the presentation who had a technical background versus not, it kind of felt like a 50-50 split in the room. Apparently, based on the survey data that they've done with a global group of product managers, over 300 respondents, I believe it was, kind of the same. So we're seeing the same spread. About a third, maybe more, came from a business background, someone like myself. Some describe themselves as non-technical, and some came from creative. So actually, there's a huge chunk of people that didn't come from a technical background, and much like a lot of the people in the room here today, are wanting to do a horizontal move from, for example, marketing or UX design, as well as the more conventional project management. That's kind of the more linear trajectory that a lot of people seem to have, but obviously there's a lot of other roles that somehow get to start dipping their toe in the pool and actually get lured more and more by how dynamic of a field it is. As I mentioned at the start of the conversation, is it better to be a niche expert that's super specialized or generalist? The vast majority answered generalist. I would assume if I could resurvey these people, it's because the product roadmap that you manage half the time is ever evolving, as well as the technologies that you're using to do that, the structure of your team, where your team is based, if you're a tiny startup that's super local or in a giant global organization. And realistically, being a generalist means you'll be able to constantly ebb and flow across what's expected of you versus being super niche and perhaps, unfortunately, sometimes being at the short end of the stick when it comes to what things get budget or support. In addition, do product managers have authority to make product roadmap decisions? Again, over and above, the answer is yes. And a huge part of the fact that you get authority is you're the one facilitating that healthy debate across dissonant groups. There's probably a laundry list for each department in a company that would want product to do X, Y, and Z, whether it's the app or a site or some kind of digital integration, and they want your team's time and effort. But you get to actually have the authority around prioritization, around what flat out gets validated with like some kind of fake user experience, and you actually can go back to a team saying, this doesn't seem to actually have a market for it. Let's revisit before we actually build it full-fledged. So in general, you get a lot of ownership. If ownership and authority to make those types of decisions scares you, product probably isn't for you because you're constantly being everyone's best friend and worst enemy, trying to kind of balance the scales of what product decisions take effect. Most importantly, and that's why it's huge font, should PMs actually write code? Again, the vast majority said no. Partly, I would posit it's a bit of a biased group if half of us are non-technical, so obviously we would want to say that. But also, over and above, I think a lot of technical teams really appreciate when the PM lets the team do their job, empowers them to make the right decisions, and doesn't solution, doesn't micromanage, doesn't question why something's being built with one particular language or framework, or gets into the bugs themselves and tries to debug them. They let their teams do their thing. Similarly with UX, et cetera. It's usually people that are interested in those fields and trying to facilitate certain conversations, but they're not actually the ones being the doers. Moreover, I would say on a personal note, it's because your time is so scarce, constantly juggling a million different things. Your team, even if you could, wouldn't want you to get into this because they want you protecting them or seeking out more interesting ideas and constantly thinking about the roadmap and not the nitty-gritty. So again, to reinforce, never a proper linear path, mine certainly wasn't, and I'd like to give you a bit of context on myself. How do I look like this? Well, I was born and raised in Mexico, so I think I bring that to the table pretty much at every role that I've ever had. Obviously, visible minority, female, et cetera, but also coming from large, densely populated cities, very different cultures than other countries, and overall having kind of my own, I guess, take on things. That's something I try to embrace, and whenever I'm interviewing for a job, it's almost like it's a dual interview where I want the interviewer to respect that I have a different voice, and then I'm bringing diversity to what's usually stereotypically not a team that looks like this in digital. I happened to spend about 2 decades in Vancouver, Canada. That's where the accent comes from. I also wanted to reinforce that even though I was going back and forth to summers in Mexico, realistically, this is where most of my education and my career started. And it just so happened to be in this building right here that's Harbor Center in SFU's campus in downtown Vancouver. In general, I credit my university a lot for the fact that even though I wasn't in a product management degree that didn't exist, they prepared me really well by having multiple campuses, a tri-semester system where I didn't have to commit to a specific cohort at any point in time. I was able to bop in and out of different programs as they were offered. And more importantly, in the BD School of Business, and I know this sounds like a sales pitch, we were given a lot of chances to provide opportunities for extracurricular involvement. That's, I think, where I really started to harness my people management style, getting to deal with managing budgets and kind of the P&L aspect of a business in terms of event management for students, and dealing with coaching for public speaking, for example, such that I'm not totally trembling up here, even though I'm admittedly always a little bit nervous. In general, I really took advantage of my opportunities on campus, but more importantly, upon graduating, I actually realized that in your first few years of a career, your opportunities are quite limited in your role. You kind of get asked to do a very specific set of things. And by continuing to be involved on campus and volunteering and being more of a mentor to those that were still in school, I was able to continue to garner those skills, or so I'd like to tell myself. So that said, defining your product vision and really making your career work for you is all about you thinking about your user experience, not necessarily comparing yourself to peers in more defined fields. So now to get into a bit more of the detail, I first joined Telus on a new grad scheme, which was supposed to be kind of a rotational program where I would dip in and out of different departments. And I was quite happy to do so. I just so happened to, in my second rotation, join the digital team and just never looked back. I loved the fact that they were incredibly progressive, that the management team was really into operating as if we were a digital startup within the confines of a giant enterprise, and we're almost like the rebels. I'll get into that more in a second. It sounds like corporate speak, but I swear it's true. This was what our stores look like. So our typical retail environment, bright, glossy, full of awesome branding, obviously all the like Apple, iPhones, etc. A really kind of futuristic, cool experience. And this is what the website looked like. So back in 2011, sad face. It was a desktop and a mobile experience. It really required you to be at your desktop for most of the functionality. If you wanted to open channel listings, you had to click on a massive PDF that would take about a minute to load to then somehow cross-triangulate with what your TV was saying about which channels you had. Just a really brutal experience, clearly not thought out in terms of what a user needed. So I just so happened to keep the fact that the header very subtly started to prompt people to go to a beta experience, which gradually evolved into this. I say gradually, it actually happened in less than 6 months. And to have that happen in a large enterprise environment is astounding. We went from old school to responsive, accessible, visually engaging, data-driven, a brand new back-end management of our content, and in general, constantly trying to validate everything we were doing, using segmentation such that you would only be presented with certain offers if you were coming from one IP address instead of the other. Again, I won't get into the nitty-gritty details. What I'd like to convey is that essentially, the roadmap management that I was doing in managing everything from the homepage through to entering an e-commerce experience was constantly impacted by a variety of different departments in the company. So it wasn't like we were just digital and tech teams doing tech things. Obviously, that's a part of it. But a massive function was actually the marketing team and constantly supporting their KPIs and various initiatives that they might have had in market, whether that was over-the-line campaigns or shiny, cool things they wanted to brag about. But at the same time, potentially finance or sales might be the ones to suddenly put the pressure on saying, we're not hitting X target, we need to launch a limited time offer, and we need to do it now. And as a product manager, you can't say, well, that's not in my sprint. I'm really busy focused on X, Y, and Z. Fair enough, make it happen somehow. And it just is what it is. If you constantly are managing your team in a self-organized way where they understand the context of why certain things are happening, why there's a kind of a tug of war of potential disruptors, for example, your team should be happy to help you launch an offer instead of being apprehensive or having any kind of adversarial dynamics. Realistically, this is the entire company, and the success of the greater whole was the overall goal. So constantly trying to foster a relationship where we were happy with the kind of dependencies on our workflow and functional distance meant that the PM could be the one to prioritize, have the difficult conversations, and once something trumped something else, then you had the ability to kind of take your team and make it happen. And obviously negotiating trade-offs along the way. So this is the team that I, loved and learned loads from. You've got UX experts, developers, analytics, someone specific to accessibility and everything to do with ensuring that our site wasn't just catering to the common ground, but to everyone that ever wanted to access anything digital, etc. You can tell it's a casual environment. You can tell it's super collaborative. This may or may not have been a positive meeting, hard to say, but in general, it was a team of really talented people, and there were actually very few of us as product managers getting the luxury of coordinating these teams. That happens to be the Toronto office. Some of what I had to do was just navigate how much of breadth and depth of expectations of a product team we had. This happens to be a RACI, so that's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, and that's kind of the color coding that you can see. So realistically, as PMs, you're vastly responsible for a lot of the prioritization, far less so, for example, in sales enablement. Those things you're kind of further down in the food chain, but in any way, shape, or form, you tend to have to be aware of everything that's happening. Again, if you don't like having breadth of experiences and constantly being CC'd or pulled into different meetings for different things, then product might not be a great fit, whereas I thrive in an environment that's constantly requiring me to shift gears and somehow enable various department success. Can anyone rattle off a few transferable skills or experiences that you think the average product manager has to have? And you can just yell them out if you want.
Stakeholder management.
Absolutely. Organization. Project management, yep. Someone needs to put an order to it all. Sales, sure.
Understanding customers.
Learning to say no, is that what you said? Nice. And?
Understanding customers.
Absolutely. Great work, guys. I've tried to rattle off a few. You'll notice that the list starts to get a bit overwhelming, and you might think, how is this humanly possible? And really, it isn't. The whole point of a PM is to try to galvanize your team of experts that will gradually be able to help you do this together. And more of these skills will continue to evolve. Realistically, though, what you would want to start to harness is, again, the stuff that AI can't do. I would argue that the creativity that it takes to sometimes work with constraints or to come up with ways to achieve a goal that maybe would have taken 2 months worth of development work, and instead you can do kind of an MVP approach of a minimum viable product that suits the need that we're trying to validate. And again, whether it's just a prototype kind of in the confines of user testing all the way through to a live experience is up to you. And obviously creativity just in general of thinking of cool new ways to do something is always great. Moreover, evidently navigating complexity and having a strategy to navigate all of these things, prioritize and figure out what has to happen in what cadence, doing tons of the people management, stakeholder management, etc. I'd quickly like to point out HIPPO stands for highest paid person's opinion. That's when subjective feedback comes in and escalations and requests from yay on high. Usually it's a CEO that had gone to a cool conference, learned about something cool, wants the company to implement it right away. Great idea, let's validate it. Let's figure out a way to ensure we don't accidentally allocate hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars into something that may not have a market or may not be the right fit for our company at that point in time. Briefly again, getting into learning new, unknown, and unstructured environments. Clearly, if nothing else, hopefully this conveys that there's constant ambiguity and you constantly are navigating the unknown, not just on your own, but for your team. And finally, above all else, as I'm sure you can imagine, you need to have compassion. Compassion not just for your end users and having a painless, streamlined user experience, but everyone behind the scenes making it all a reality. This is all very product focused, but as I was showing you guys before, various different departments are measured on different things. Some just have sales targets. Some have maybe time to respond to a call in a call service center, etc. There's a lot of different KPIs happening in the background that can sometimes make your role feel adversarial, but you should actually be able to convey how you're able to actually navigate the conflicting priorities and have it be more of a win-win. So number 2 is build your career to scale. As you can imagine, the fact that I was really happy at Telus, that I was in Vancouver the whole time, always kind of in the same perimeter, I was happy with my leadership team, the team itself, I decided I need to shake something up. I needed to scale my career. I could have stayed happily within that employer, but I felt like it was the right time to really just shake it off and gain transferable skills in a completely different environment, just to show that I could be adaptable. I'll happily go back to Telus if they'll ever take me, but essentially what I really wanted to do is ensure that I was leveraging my strengths and trying something new. Moreover, this type of imagery about London had constantly won me over, and I knew that if I forced myself out of my comfort zone to a completely different environment, obviously a much larger city than Vancouver, incredibly diverse both in terms of population, industries, the types of sizes of opportunities with a budding tech scene. In general, it felt like the right thing to do, and because I happen to have the luxury of being Canadian, there's a Tier 5 visa that enabled that. I could do an entire presentation on visas and the UK since I'm on my 3rd one. I'll skip that for now, but come talk to me later if you're one of those impacted. My first role in London was at Ticketmaster. As I mentioned, it was to kind of transition my enterprise experience, but now pivoting into more of a live entertainment space. I'm a huge fan of live entertainment, whether it's going to comedy, West End theater, live sports, live music, etc. So my role when I accepted a 6-month contract initially was to join Ticketmaster and revamp what, again, was a bit more of an old school experience into a really responsive, visually engaging, scalable experience. I say that because not only were we going from this to this, but we were adopting 19 different markets in the background. So supporting Spain and their cinema revenue stream versus Scandinavia and exhibits. In the UK, the massive tug of war across West End theater, rugby, and various other competitors, along with any time Drake has a concert announcement. And obviously that gig is going to take over the main marketing space. What was really great is not only did I get to play with more of the user experience, I also now got to switch into tooling and understanding what was happening in the background. So some of these things are powered by algorithms that show, what's selling the most, or what's most recent. Those are just happening behind the scenes. But the curation of certain events being displayed to certain audiences at certain points in the day, for example, was usually more of a manual marketing effort, or certain escalations were made of this event just got announced and it trumps this other one because we're seeing it selling better. Someone behind the scenes had to go in and actually curate that content. So I was tasked with how to come up with that single tooling experience to enable those 19 different market success. And I'm really glad I got to do that because I learned a ton that I would have otherwise not been exposed to, such as a lot of what's happening in this wheel. Yellow denotes the stuff that product managers seem to do the most. Green is a little less frequent, but they still have exposure. So you can see that anything about gaining user feedback, prototyping, experimenting, you're, again, kind of pulled in all different directions. And this is particularly pertinent if you're ever working on tooling, because your user truly is going to be what makes or breaks if your product was actually a success. Third lesson, know your acceptance criteria. So know yourself and try to come up with value-based decision-making instead of just the next role that gets presented to you. We're all under a lot of pressures, whether that's financial or social, or generally feeling like I need to do this because my manager's been so great. He's asking me to stick around with the team another 2 years instead of taking a more lucrative position. I feel like I owe it to him. Totally a personal choice. Just make sure that you're doing it, taking everything else into account. And again, trying to leverage your strengths every step of the way. So this is where Boiler Room comes in. This happens to be a screenshot of Catering, who's a DJ. This is a giant space that is probably more of an art gallery usually. It's not a conventional music gig. And the whole point is that, again, similar to product school, they would have just a camera and some form of live streaming capability, as well as then editing it a bit and cutting it down into chunks that you can access on, for example, YouTube, and watch or listen to this set over and over, as I apparently tend to do. And it's kind of someone's interesting gateway into different types of music, or potentially voyeuristically getting to basically attend events all over the world. I was really keen on joining the team, not only because, as you can tell from how passionate I am about emerging underground music, but also it's a startup. Even though the brand is actually quite established, if you're an underground music fan, realistically, it's been a small team based out of London all along. They still are. And realistically, there's a lot of magic happening behind the scenes, including really tight turnaround times if a last-minute artist wants us to broadcast them, or really long projects such as kind of a Pan-Africa tour that's getting done with a brand partnership. So there's constant tug of war of what felt like a little bit of experiential marketing, but also some kind of cool digital KPIs, and in general having a really tiny galvanized team working together. This is the evolution of their site. They've essentially never been that dependent on their website because, again, the content gets archived onto YouTube, SoundCloud, etc. So really, it's ubiquitous anyway. But they'd always wanted the site to be the definitive archive of over 6,000 performances from shows at over 200 cities, having all that metadata and being able to be incredibly niche in what subgenre you're into, or being able to explore something by what city it happened in, for example. So this is the part of the presentation that gets a little bit sad. Essentially, within my first 2 months of leading the product team, there happened to be budget cuts, changes in strategy, and an overall change in vision, and I lost most of my product team. Incredibly painful, especially being a brand new employee into the company and knowing that it was just a necessary evil that had to happen at that point in time for us to shift our priorities elsewhere. So what that challenged me to do is, okay, based on a smaller team that we've got, how are we going to focus our efforts? So for example, we redesigned the site. As I'm sure you can recall, it used to have this kind of secondary nav, again, a bit more of an old school feel, and instead we went into a transparent kind of full bleed header, more dynamic elements, far more visually engaging, hopefully, as well as some kind of cleanup behind the scenes that I won't bore you to tears with, but cleaning up some tech debt that we had incurred, including kind of changing up our nav elements such that we could drive more traffic to the shop, because now we're focused more on creating more merchandise and constantly funneling people that might be curious about different aspects of what we do in an easier way, and front loading the search element. And a lot of effort went into that one to really make it top notch. But also getting into the tooling side of things and enabling the teams behind the scenes. So whenever they set up an event in the back end, it's usually a project manager out on the field, or someone scoping out venues and talking to artists, potentially having to work with a lot of different record labels and venue management, all tight timelines. And they used to have a lot of manual processes and spreadsheets and emails flying around trying to coordinate stuff. Instead, we created an end-to-end RSVP system where users could put in their information and the PM could easily galvanize the guest list that then kind of gets sent out an invite as the chosen ones that get to attend that particular event. I was also very lucky to deal with GDPR coming into effect. So essentially anything to do with data protection and making sure that we had done our due diligence to always ensure that people weren't getting spammed by accident, that it was only those that had opted in to receive marketing emails. And again, the fact that we work with Valentine's, Aristoff, et cetera, there's a lot of brands that we work with, and we wanted to reassure them that we were doing all of our digital due diligence. And finally, again, just really making sure that accessibility was actually something that was paramount. The site that we had previously had never been audited for that before, and so little things like ensuring that on your phone you were able to easily toggle across, that if you wanted to specify your gender as unspecified, that's something that we were able to offer. Really navigating the legal territory of, if you're opting to attend an event, here's what you're agreeing to, and being very forthcoming and transparent, as user-focused as possible, while still kind of keeping the cool vibes. In addition, we were asked to launch a sub-brand because essentially, rather than just having live performances from boiler rooms, we started to acquire a lot of music documentaries, cool music-related content, interviews, clips, and essentially having a curatorial lens. So we launched something called 4:3, which just happens to be an aspect ratio. But as you can see, it's actually just kind of a skin on the boiler room experience. The infrastructure behind the scenes was kept the same. The content management system was the same. You can see that a lot of the nav elements are actually just stylized in a different way. But essentially for a dev team that had become quite small, we were able to still keep up with the pace of everything and build stuff in a scalable way. So that was kind of a nice point of pride, as well as introducing authentication and all kinds of things that were kind of evolving the digital experience in a very, again, tiny team that kind of was making it all happen. So this is where I shift gears a bit, because I wanted to, again, kind of connect the dots across the fact that I would have never thought I would end up in product management in the first place, let alone staying at Telus for about 5 years and really getting into all kinds of interesting acquisition and retention strategies in a giant corporation. From there, switching into Ticketmaster and getting to play with the live entertainment space, tooling, internationalization, et cetera, and then kind of transitioning that again into more of a tiny startup environment from a tech space, especially after those layoffs took effect. All of those things, I think, are what has been accidentally a really interesting journey to now get into stuff that actually requires hardware. So I've never had the luxury of having a tangible good that comes out of any of these things, unless you consider a ticket from Ticketmaster tangible, but usually it's a QR code on your phone. Now that I'm at Charged Up, this thing is a little phone charger, as you can see. I didn't bring the toaster, but it's essentially this little station that you guys might see in like a Brewdog or a bunch of other London pubs. There's about 350 locations in London right now, and it's gradually going to double and then double again and start to take on a life of its own. And what I'm excited about is that I'm now being forced to not only understand kind of the IoT integration aspect, but also being really focused on app development and on really understanding everything happening behind the scenes. So with Charged Up, which for those watching the video might get a better sense than looking at a little box from far away, this is what the app looks like. So when you open it up, you can see a view of London in this particular screenshot of everywhere where we've currently got a station. Fairly ubiquitous already, similar to the Santander bikes. And again, it's going to continue to grow. Evidently, this requires a lot of scaling, load balancing, et cetera, as well as constantly optimizing the UX. So this is already an outdated screenshot because tomorrow my team is deploying a completely different layout of these things, seeing that some of these elements aren't being engaged with as much, and we want to raise the prominence of others, constantly optimizing and catering to the data coming in. Here's kind of the onboarding flow, and I know there's torn opinions online about whether you should ever teach your user how to use something versus creating such a seamless experience it teaches you on its own. We currently feel that because there is a hardware piece to it, the fact that you have to learn how to go about doing things, currently it feels necessary to educate people. But again, just like with bike sharing, maybe gradually people will start to catch on and this won't be necessary. Moreover, this is what a dashboard looks like behind the scenes, actually tracking all of the stations, the battery packs themselves, etc. In the meanwhile, I have to keep track of the app and all of the various users, the different funnels that they might be doing, the happy path of the app in terms of how to perhaps register their account or how to set up a payment function, because even though it's super affordable, there is a slight monetary transaction happening. In addition to even tracking the actual SIM cards, and I've obviously blurred that out quite a bit so you don't get to track that in particular, but essentially there's a lot of dashboards, tons of data, and thankfully the ability to constantly influence what we're tracking and why. All of which just boils down to simplifying the experience for someone to take their phone, scan the QR code on a station, have one of these guys pop out, take it, charge their phone, and pop it back in when they're done. It should be as seamless as that for the user. We get to worry about everything else behind the scenes. So again, this is where you'll see the product and it will continue to grow. Feel free to chat to me if you have any questions, especially for those of you here in London. And again, to reiterate, if nothing else, here are hopefully the key takeaways that you've gotten from today. I feel really strongly about you defining your career and taking ownership of that product vision, continuing to build it to scale whenever possible, and constantly garnering transferable skills that you can actually then adapt accordingly to different roles, and knowing what your acceptance criteria is. So not necessarily getting pulled away by other pressures, making sure that you're using your insights and attending these types of events or reading up on product resources on what's coming soon or what's expected of you will hopefully continue to have you be at kind of the vanguard of your career and making you super appealable. Any questions from the room? Go ahead.
How did you feel about going from web product management to mobile app product management?
Excellent question. So adapting from web dev to app. I think it's something that actually came up in the interview where someone was concerned that I might think it's too slow or that it's too gated versus with web, you can just make changes on the fly. I quite like it because it forces you to really prioritize a roadmap. You can't just kind of go, throw in a ticket, someone will launch it by end of day, we'll see how it goes, whatever. It's far less impulsive. You actually have to build more of a business case or a justification for doing something. At the same time, I think it's incredibly powerful that you can immediately blast a change out and it's something that's in everyone's pockets and it's a part of their day-to-day like habitual use, as opposed to web, which we all kind of know, unless you need to go to a website for something, you're using it a lot less. So the impact of an app, if it's used a lot, is actually just massive by comparison. Yourself?
Which different data analytics tools do you use for your, is it that you use or you have a team which helps you with analytics?
Great question. So in terms of analytics, I've had exposure to Omniture, GA, Mixpanel now with the app itself. There's probably at least 2 or 3 more. Actually, Hotjar, Crazy Egg, and another heat mapping one, very specific to the qualitative side of UX. In addition to using some white label services where you can put up a prototype and not necessarily convey your brand, but you just kind of get to track the analytics of a blank experience and then see if you absorb it yourself. So in general, a lot. And it keeps changing. It's something that I think every employer, sometimes they get given like a free trial on something, and so you end up just adopting whatever happens to be affordable. Other times, again, if you go to a conference or you have a really great account manager that's able to tell you exactly why they're the right fit for you at that point in time, you end up getting to, as the PM, just go along for the ride of the ever-changing tools. Something I think we're quite blessed with is the tools are getting easier and easier to use. They're far more UI-driven versus previously you needed to really understand them. I still think that the courses Product School offers, like including, learning analytics and SQL and all that stuff, I should probably do because at some point I'm missing out on part of the story. But depending on the nature of your team, you might have someone that's specifically dedicated to analytics and you just need to be able to talk the talk and ask the right questions and understand.
Thank you.
No worries. Next question.
How did you go about shifting industries from a kind of customer research, kind of user understanding point of view?
Do you have an example in particular?
So like, for example, moving to Ticketmaster, moving more into kind of live entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
Did you kind of have a plan in terms of how to kind of get to grips with the customer and understand kind of like the needs of the user?
Definitely. So the question was related to understanding the user and shifting from Telus into Ticketmaster. It actually goes hand in hand with the analytics. When I first joined TM back in 2017, the project just didn't happen to have budget for anyone else. It was initially hire the PM and we'll gradually build out the roadmap from there. So I didn't have someone in analytics to rely on. I just had to do it myself. So I dove into a lot of our tools. I put forth a lot of, here's what I'm seeing. At some point, it would be great if someone else could validate these hypotheses. But again, because a lot of the programs are now really user-friendly, you could even just screenshot certain flows and genuinely see engagement with our search is much greater than the sub-nav, for example. So maybe I can bring the presentation back because that might be helpful. Let's see. Not to give everyone a seizure if you're trying to follow along, but essentially, we were able to start to dispel a lot of the myths that maybe marketing might have had with regards to we think we need to have these 7 global nav elements, and instead we were able to whittle them down and bring forth the priority of other stuff. And it was very data-driven, very much using as many tools as we could to have those conversations. Not every conversation was one, but we were able to bring forth the rationale of why. No worries. Sure. Am I involved in pricing? Yes and no. With Telus, I was involved in the display of the pricing. So initially, there was a pricing lockup that we had because, not to bore you with context, but if you had bundles versus a single product, you paid different rates, as well as depending on where you lived, if you were on fiber optic internet versus not, and other various pieces. So essentially, we could either bombard you with price points or lead with the lowest price point. Guess which one marketing wanted to use? So usually they're like, please lead people with the one that somehow magically is super duper cheap, even if it's almost impossible for anyone to get. So obviously, as a team that's very user-focused and as user-centric as possible, we felt really uncomfortable with that because it's a bait and switch. It's giving someone the teeny tiny price point and then actually bombarding them with, here's all these extra costs you might not have expected. How we dovetailed that was trying to leverage analytics. And so again, IP segmentation. If you happened to have internet with us and you were connecting through a Telus IP, we already knew you have internet, therefore you'll be eligible for this bundle. But at the same time, we know you have internet, but not fiber. So we should show you this price point, but not this price point. Getting really clever and integrating technology that was going to do some of that hard work for us to ensure the right user was being shown the right price point at the right point in time. Same thing for like legal footnotes. I think sometimes in large companies, you're kind of expected to lead with a giant paragraph and scare people away with all this fine print because a legal team feels strongly, whereas marketing says, don't put any of that on there. You're going to scare people away from making a purchase. We always try to kind of find that fine balance of, if nothing else, people need to know X, Y, and Z. The rest you can kind of have in a more dynamic flow.
What are the ups and downs of communicating with the CEO?
Excellent question. So ups and downs of communicating with, I'll say, senior management in general.
Senior management, CEO, and whoever has a vision.
Definitely.
Of the company.
I think it's a tough one because initially you'll want to be everyone's best friend. You want to kind of gain everyone's good graces. And it's always flattering to say, oh, you have a meeting with the CEO, you have the presentation with the C-suite. That's great. You have their attention. At the same time, you're throwing yourselves to the wolves and they might come up with a lot of grilling you on a plan that you've put forward or bombarding you with new ideas and saying, hey, can we have that by next week? Because there's this crazy cool thing and it'd be great if you could do that. I think it's important for you to just be confident in what you bring to the table, in the conversations you've had with your team, in general, in being quite forthcoming and not time boxing or over-promising and under-delivering. At the same time, you do want to be open to those conversations. It's a great opportunity to spotlight your team and to showcase how hard they're working or the fact that they're working on the right thing. So it's a double-edged sword and you just have to navigate that and constantly be really conscious of their time. So make sure you always have a key, like an agenda, a few key things that you're trying to accomplish with the meeting and not just talk their ear off or be too shy to ask difficult questions that actually it might be the perfect opportunity to go, we've been asking, a few other teams about X, Y, and Z. Do you happen to have context on our long-term strategy for this? Or should we even bother worrying about this if that's something that's about to change? So it's a really interesting opportunity and you have to plan ahead to use it wisely. Question was over here, I think. Sure.
How do you choose where to spend your time if you have to worry about an 18-month roadmap and vision and also maybe a 3-month sprint plan and then actually executing the current sprint or two? How do you sort of allocate your weekly time, where you're spending your energy, and even also spending energy in terms of just buy-in from all the stakeholders you have to keep on your side? You've only got, say 40 hours a week, whatever it is. Where are you really investing your time? How do you allocate that out?
Excellent question. So related to allocating time across really long-term big projects versus kind of more short-term. I would say it was very case by case. It depends on the environment of your company as well as maybe even seasonality. There might be things that feel like they're on fire right now and they absolutely are. And sometimes there's just fake pressure or the sense of something needing to be quite urgent. I always try to find that duplicity and constantly have context on what's coming so that I can future-proof stuff, but at the same time being a bit more nimble and catering to stuff that's more short-term and more immediate. In essence, I think my biggest strategy for dealing with that is delegation. You start to have to trust a team member. So for example, you might start to depend more on a UX lead or your senior developer. Someone that I found phenomenal to work with in one of my teams was our QA engineer, someone that knows the ins and outs, and so QA meaning quality assurance and kind of the testing side. They were great at gathering context, asking the right questions in meetings, really getting into the nitty-gritty of stuff such that I could actually ask her to attend some meetings on my behalf or start to get CC'd in emails. And I was CC'd, but half the time, let's face it, I was probably ignoring those things altogether. And it was her ability to really pick out certain details that she was our voice at the table. So she was attending those meetings and then relaying that information back. Obviously, that goes hand in hand with having a self-organized team that's really motivated and actually wants to bring that forth. She could have easily said, I like testing and I like looking at screen flows. Don't throw me into meetings. It just so happened that not only did she see the need, but she actually liked the opportunity to enrich her skill set. So yeah, my very short answer to that would just be delegation and trying to, you can't clone yourself, you need to empower your team. Sure.
What are different ways of managing conflicts? Because you told us that there are lots of places where you have
Yes.
to say no and you have to be a friend as well as an enemy.
Absolutely. So navigating conflict is probably one of my favorite parts of the job because that's when you know you're actually adding value. Like rather than teams being at odds with each other, they're understanding why some things need to happen, or at the very least adding that sense of empathy. So for example, anything that impacts a customer service team or retail store employees, you kind of have to sometimes shift people's perceptions because sometimes they've been so, deep in sales target spreadsheets that they're going, well, let's just launch 2 offers and have everything, firing on all cylinders. You have to try to get them to empathize with, right, if you were a store rep at that time, how are you possibly going to convey that to customers well, or how will they even be trained in time to do the right thing? So trying to bring empathy into the boardroom or into when you're prioritizing. Again, though, data plays a really big part. So you can bring forth a case of when something didn't go very well and why, and use that data as a case study to your advantage, or vice versa. Like, actually, we should instead do this because this thing that we did actually moved the needle more versus just being reactive and repeating a previous mistake. But to clarify, there's never a moment where you're going to win across the board. Just like with giving this presentation, some people might be getting great stuff out of it and some might be going, this is totally not what I thought I would hear today. Can't win them all. You have to be okay with that. That's part of the nature of being a PM. And there'll be, again, seasonality of some people will love you during Boxing Day because you're enabling hitting those targets. Other teams might really want you to focus on tech debt and think that you're ignoring some of the more kind of behind the scenes that actually needs a lot of love as well. Sure.
What's your least favorite part of the job?
Least favorite, I think, to be honest, is looking at the data in a very granular way. I'm not a very patient problem solver, which is why I'm not a developer. I think I like to get a general sense and look at stats in more of an aggregate function versus when you're genuinely trying to suss out a very specific detail. I'm not very patient with myself, so I like being the kind of the tug of war, attending a million meetings, being super extroverted, all that stuff, versus if you have to get me for 3 to 5 days to just look at spreadsheets, I might start to go a little bit batty and find an excuse to delegate it to someone else.
How often do you speak to customers, and if so, through which channels?
Great question. So speaking to customers is different depending on each role. With Charged Up, for example, we have a really direct line of sight because there's an intercom integration. So anytime if you're a user and you have help, like say the QR code isn't scanning properly or something is gone awry for whatever reason, someone can prompt intercom right away and someone on our team is able to respond. But I have direct line of sight into that. I get an email notification anytime one of those inquiries happens. What does that do? It means that all of us have ownership and accountability around these are the pain points that people are finding. So even if it's not me having that direct conversation, and technically I could open the app and be like, hey, how can I help you? It's really great to have that immediacy of seeing what my peers are doing and how they're able to counter a particular issue. But also there's obviously like app reviews are a great way to understand pain points. Like if I recently saw someone from the US didn't realize that in the app you can change the country code that the SMS gets sent to for a 2-step verification. They just assumed because they saw on the screen +44 that it was just for UK customers. We actually have a way for you to tap into that, then scroll down and then put in your number. But the app review was quite, devastating, going 1 star, this is ridiculous, I can't believe you're not catering to tourists, blah, 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 blah. And so truly that shows, okay, a really easy UI fix is just for us to make it obvious that that's an element that is dynamic. Therefore, let's put that into our next sprint or put it in the backlog for it to get prioritized onto our roadmap.
And what about user research?
So I've been quite lucky that there's been some opportunities to do proper user research in that you actually bring customers in, ask them some scripted questions, or you can record the motions of what they're doing in any given user flow, et cetera. In general, I find user research can always be a bit biased and a bit contrived, but still very, very valuable. So as long as you can kind of pair it up with more aggregate data and go, okay, it looks like based on just 5 respondents, because there's a science to that, if 5 respondents give you the same feedback, then obviously that's like what you need to do. If it's a bit more fragmented, look at the data and figure out who should be the loudest voice based on kind of more of a bell curve model. Sure.
you a full stack product owner? And what I mean by that is you own both the customer experience and the backend services? And if so, what did you like and dislike about having both parts of like owning the whole product end to end?
So I was not full stack at Telus. I was very much the go-to-market side. And so anything driving, what I liked about it was the duplicity of both acquisition as well as retention. And again, even just those two teams usually being at odds for a variety of reasons, I guess. But in every other role thereafter, so I guess upon moving to London, I've had the luxury of working with both. Realistically, I still don't think that the tooling aspect is my forte, just because the sheer nature of my years at Telus meant that I was always focused on the end user. But I've really enjoyed getting to interview departments and department heads all the way through to like people doing the actual work on nights and weekends if something goes wrong, and really understanding their needs. I think it's given me a very interesting perspective, and again, kind of practicing empathy. But I like the fact that I get to play with both. I'm not sure to what degree I would ever be comfortable abandoning users altogether and shifting just onto tooling, though that might actually be career-wise maybe a great next step, because obviously that's uncharted territory and I should probably take my own advice that I've been sharing today. Sure.
How much time do you generally spend on product roadmaps, like arriving at a agreed upon product roadmap? And how do you decide whether it is an annual or half yearly or like quarterly? What's the best approach according to you?
Right. So I'm struggling to answer roadmap prioritization because it's actually something that you do almost daily.
Okay.
Sort of. There are certain aspects of a roadmap that your team genuinely owns. So literally a developer might say, we need to do X. No one else in the company knows about it, understands it, probably doesn't care. You need to be the one to really understand, like, okay, this matters because at some point it's going to slow us down or it's going to become a roadblock. So those conversations are happening on a day-to-day. Meanwhile, to the question in the back before, an 18-month-long project that is gonna, there's gonna come in waves and you gradually need to ramp up to it. Again, you do need to constantly understand the context and how it's evolving, because 18 months is a lifetime. I've actually never had the luxury of working on a project that's that long, but something like the both Ceci and Rio games back when I was at Telus, obviously those are massive marketing milestones. There was a lot of content integration in terms of, as a telco, we were selling the subscription model of watch every event on demand and live stream, across 40 different channels, all the way through to just implementing some of the collateral across the board. I would think I was involved in Ceci 2014 conversations as early as the end of 2012 because we knew that it was happening. With Rio, what was hilarious is that we initially had a scope of this, and then 2.5 months before the games, the company was able to secure a really great hardware deal and give away a TV as well as some other stuff happening behind the scenes that just made it really fortuitous. So we were suddenly tasked to support a really intense, exciting, compelling offer, but in a really short amount of time. When initially we thought, oh yeah, Rio, we know what that means. We've got our scope. It's been planned. We're got it. We're done. And it was certainly not the case. It was my final work day that we launched right before I moved to London. And it was super exciting, but obviously overwhelming. And it's the kind of thing that you hope you can mitigate. But at the same time, it's a large corporation. Decisions get made. Profits have to come in some way. And in this particular case, the offer was actually really great for users. So it was something that we all could galvanize towards. It just meant having to get particularly scrappy on how to make it happen.
Thank you.
No worries.
In terms of, again, day-to-day work, how involved in articulating kind of brutal ROI and financial return on the periods of time in the roadmap do you have to be able to talk about and articulate, or is it just like this is self-evident? I always struggle with that, whether something
right.
we're hearing is self-evident, or if we need to define the ROI with hard numbers. Where do you sort of sit in that?
So I've never officially had to make an airtight business case for something and have to put forth a budget, but I've done it at a high level. So it's almost like in quarterly planning or monthly planning, what will happen and why, and needing to justify potentially taking a hit in revenue to instead drive awareness of something. For example, there was a motion coming in where something was going to have a fee implemented, and that was going to impact our existing customer base as well as anyone that signed up after a certain date in the calendar. We knew we could continue to just push offers and just bombard people with kind of sales tactics, but it was the unethical thing to do. And in general, if we wanted to be a telco that was really focused on being, user-friendly and differentiate ourselves from the pack and not be seen as the guys with the hidden fees, we actually knew it's to our benefit in the long term as a business to be really forthcoming and to constantly ensure that there's an overall strategy for making sure there's awareness of that and that no one feels bill shock when they suddenly get an extra. It was a tiny charge, it was like a tiny percentage, but still, no one likes seeing, what is this? Is this a new tax or levy that no one bothered to tell me about? Like, that irritates people and it might cause them to switch providers. So we put forth a really strong case, and thankfully, through enough escalations and going into steering committees and really kind of fighting the good fight, saying this is the right thing to do, it will pay off. We can almost guarantee that we'll get more loyalty and our retention numbers will be stronger. We were able to do that, and thankfully, immediately the users spoke, and sure enough, there was a lack of negative KPIs. So stuff like less negative tweets, less calls into our call center with people disgruntled going, what is this, or why am I being charged this? In general, less negative impact to our user base, and you can easily quantify that, and anything to do with would you recommend this provider to a friend looked quite positive because customers were thanking us saying, okay, I'm aware of what's happening, you told me what the impact would be, I'm not scared of it, it makes sense. Sure.
How do you prioritize your roadmap items?
Again, it's a variety of things. I think largely being able to quantify which other KPIs will be affected, because you can't just think about, for example, app downloads. Well, you can drive people to download an app, they might not necessarily ever open it. And everything to do with pirate metrics, I don't know if anyone's familiar with that term. So the, I guess like adoption, acquisition, et cetera. You need to be quite concrete when you're prioritizing across different departments or across different people why you're doing things a certain way. And I would say trying to balance across. So again, not just thinking about acquiring new users, but then also retaining them. Or, as I was saying before, anything to do with tech debt and to what extent your team goes, at some point we need to refactor, or we're going to need to redesign X or re-implement Y. Fair enough, let's get more context and let's ensure that I can fight the good fight and can convey to other teams, your thing has to wait because my team is feeling very strongly about this. By us spending 2 weeks doing this, suddenly we will be able to much more quickly or much more reliably scale up. So it's having those conversations, understanding the context, and ideally having both a quantitative and a qualitative aspect so that you have ammo in the boardroom versus just being told, right, but what about blah. But again, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a PM that has had complete smooth sailing and has never been grilled or questioned on why sometimes trade-offs are required. There's also obviously the notion of sometimes teams are comfortable with bringing in freelancers or extra team members from other teams. There's pros and cons on both sides, and you need to really size up whether adding more people and needing to onboard more people onto a tech stack, giving them the temporary luxury of doing stuff that they're not going to be held accountable for, and then leaving it for your team to absorb. Is it worth it just to kind of ramp up speed? Or if anything, will it maybe actually be a detriment? So it's considering all of those pieces, and also from a budget standpoint, obviously, like I said before, the creativity through constraints constantly creeps up because there's always endless opportunity. You need to be quite selective in the cadence of something being prioritized.